again, my name is Brother Nathan Linton, and welcome to Superior Disciple. In my past several videos, we've been going through the life of St. Francis of Assisi, really kind of delving into the details, trying to figure out who was this great saint of the Church, and what does he have to teach us today. When we last left Francis, he was in the middle of the town square in Assisi, surrounded by members and citizens of Assisi, having been dragged there by his father Pietro before the bishop, hoping that the bishop would disinherit Francis from their family, remove any rights that he had to their family's wealth. But it was Francis instead who said, "No longer is Pietro Bernardone my father, but our Father who art in heaven." And it was then that Francis committed himself to living a life following God. Though he wasn't quite sure what that was going to look like yet, he knew that this is what he was being called to. And basically everyone thought he was crazy. The people of Assisi thought he was, out of his mind. They knew him as this young man who was not only rich, but was popular, throwing these opulent parties, wearing the finest clothings, all of a sudden to give it up, taking on and wearing the clothing of a hermit, this gray tunic with a leather belt and a staff, right? The bishop would have given him, kind of protected him in this life, but still, people thought he was nuts. People thought he was insane. So Francis went out into the forests. And St. Bonaventure says that he goes out into the forest seeking solitude and seeking silence for prayer. And while he was out in the forest, he sang. He sang songs in French, which he would have learned from his mother Pica, who was also French. So he was out and he was feeling peace. He was feeling great joy and happiness, contentment in his life, though he wasn't sure what he was supposed to be doing. When along came these robbers, these bandits, these outlaws living in the forests. And they came and they saw Francis and said, "Who are you?" They heard him making this noise. "Who do you think you are?" And Francis says, "I am the herald of the great king." St. Bonaventure says he says this in a prophetic voice. "I am the messenger of the great king." And these bandits again thought he was insane. These outlaws, these people who have been rejected from society, take Francis and throw him in a ditch filled with snow. And what does Francis do? He rolls around, stands up, and says, "Praise be God." He begins to sing and fill the forest again with the praises of God. He had been transformed through this conversion to a life in Christ. And he no longer cared what people thought. He knew that he was doing what God was calling him to do. Well, eventually Francis made his way, because he was living without means, made his way to a monastery nearby, a Benedictine monastery, and there he prayed and he begged for alms, he begged for food, and the monks there even kind of thought that he was a little strange. They hadn't heard about him, they hadn't heard about his story. So they made him work in the kitchens, and they kind of gave him a little bit of food and sent him on his way. And when the prior of the monastery realized and heard the stories about this Francis, this man of God, he actually went out and found Francis and apologized for the way that the monks had treated him, and made sure to give him, bread so that he could sustain himself. Well, Francis, in the meantime, was still trying to figure out what God was calling him to do. He knew he was on the right path, but not entirely sure yet. But he figures that God first spoke to him, first called him to this life, called him to mission in the Church of San Damiano. After all, it was there that Jesus himself spoke to Francis from the cross, saying, "Francis, go and rebuild my church, which is falling into ruin." And Francis first took those words literally. He began building up this church brick by brick, And when he would finished at San Damiano, he moved to another church in the plains of Assisi. And when he was done with that, he moved to Our Lady of the Angels, what we call the Portiuncula, which became almost the center of the Franciscan order once the order began. Because remember, at this point, it's kind of just Francis. But one day in the midst of all of this work, one day in the midst of his attempts at living this gospel life, at living the life that God was calling him to, Francis went to Mass. I'm sure he went to Mass more than once, but on one occasion, while he was at Mass, he heard the priest proclaiming this reading and explaining this reading. And Francis goes to the priest after Mass and begs him, "Explain to me line by line, teach me again what the gospel was, teach me again what Christ was calling." And it was from the Gospel of Luke, and it was Christ sending out the disciples 2 by 2 to go and preach. He was, "Take nothing with you for the journey, neither staff, nor purse, nor bread, nor second tunic, nor sandals for your feet." And Francis says, "This is it. This is what I want with all my life. I want to live the gospel." And so Francis, who had been wearing the habit of a hermit, fashions a new habit, one in which the shape of the cross can be seen, one which was poor and which was simple. No longer did he have a staff or a purse to carry. No longer did he wear a leather belt, a sign of comfort, but took for himself a simple rope to be his belt, and began going barefoot in the world. Francis was not sure what exactly God was calling him to, but he was not afraid. He trusted God, and he trusted that if he was truly doing what God was calling him to do, he would be satisfied, and that God would take care of him, would provide for his needs. And in doing so, God revealed slowly, bit by bit, brick by brick, the plan which he was revealing, the plan which he had for Francis. May we in our lives trust in God's love and in God's providence, following him step by step, building up his kingdom brick by brick, so that we too may be truly united to Christ and live his gospel message. My name is Brother Nathan Linton, and thank you again for joining me here at Superior Disciple.